The first wireless television remote control contained no batteries. It held no circuit board, no transistor, no electronics of any kind. Inside a palm-sized case of chrome and plastic, weighing 8 ounces, 4 tiny aluminum rods sat waiting for 4 tiny hammers to strike them. When a viewer pressed one of the 4 buttons in a Zenith showroom in Chicago in 1956, a hammer fell and a note rang out at a frequency too high for most human ears to hear. That sound, traveling through open air with no wire and no signal, struck a microphone inside the television set across the room and changed the channel. The device drew no power. The energy came entirely from the pressure of a thumb on a button, and the command it carried was nothing more than a vibrating piece of metal singing a note that only the television could understand. The click was audible even if the ultrasonic tone above it was not, and people started calling every remote control that came after it by a name that lasted for generations. They called it the clicker. That piece of metal striking metal in midair, in a world still lit by vacuum tubes and crowned by rabbit ear antennas, is the ancestor of the thing now dissolved into every screen you touch. The story of how it got from those 4 aluminum rods to the voice command on your phone is stranger, more fought over, and more consequential than the remote control has ever been given credit for. You're watching Digital Relics, where we follow the machines that quietly rearranged how people live all the way back to the first crude version, and the hands that built it. If that's the kind of history you come here for, subscribe now and hit like, because the origin of the remote control begins with one man's personal hatred of television commercials, and the engineer he sent to solve the problem never finished college. Before the remote control, television was a piece of furniture you served. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the set sat in the corner of the living room like a wooden cabinet with a glowing eye, and the family arranged itself around it in a half circle that all faced one direction. Whatever the broadcaster decided to show, in whatever order, at whatever time, was what you watched. If a commercial came on, you watched that too. Or you stood up, crossed the room, and turned the dial by hand. If you wanted a different channel, you grabbed the knob and clicked it forward, one station at a time. Each click a physical rotation of the tuner drum inside the set. If the volume was wrong, you got up again. If the picture rolled, you got up again. Television demanded attendance. For most families, the youngest child became the unofficial remote control, dispatched from the sofa on command to change the channel and adjust the volume. It was a job with no title and no pay, and millions of children held it without knowing they were filling a gap that the entire electronics industry was about to spend a decade trying to close. One man hated the arrangement more than most. Eugene F. McDonald Jr., the co-founder and president of Zenith, was a World War I Navy veteran who still went by the Commander decades after the war ended. McDonald had built Zenith into one of the largest electronics companies in the country, and he had a problem with television that was intensely personal. He despised commercials, not in the way most viewers found them mildly annoying, but with a focused executive fury that he directed at his own engineers. The story Zenith told for decades was that McDonald ordered his team to build a device that would let him kill a commercial from across the room without leaving his chair. The documented record of that exact demand is thinner than the legend suggests, filtered through years of corporate retelling, and honest history requires a flag here. But what followed was real. McDonald's engineers began working on the problem in the late 1940s, and the first person to attempt a solution was not a senior engineer with a wall of diplomas. It was a 20-year veteran of the company who had started in the stockroom, taught himself mechanical engineering on the job, and never finished college. His name was Eugene Pauly. The idea of controlling a machine from a distance, however, was far older than television. In 1898, Nikola Tesla stood beside a large indoor pool at Madison Square Garden in New York and demonstrated a 4-foot boat he called the Teleautomaton. The craft held an electric motor, a storage battery, and a radio wave receiver, and Tesla controlled it from the edge of the pool using a transmitter that sent radio frequency pulses through tuned circuits. The audience, unable to comprehend what they were seeing, speculated that a trained monkey might be hidden inside the hull. Tesla received U.S. patent 613,008 for the method and imagined unmanned torpedo boats guided by radio waves. The future he described arrived, but not as a weapon. It arrived as a way to change the channel. Zenith's first answer to McDonald's demand was the Lazy Bones, introduced in 1950. It was a small rectangular box connected to the television by a cable roughly 20 feet long. Two buttons activated electric motors inside the set that rotated the tuner dial forward or backward. It sold for about $30, roughly $375 in today's money, and Zenith marketed it as a luxury of modern living. The problem was the wire. 20 feet of thick cable running across the living room floor tripped housewives, snagged children's feet, and drew complaints from every corner of the country. The Lazy Bones worked. The wire was intolerable. 5 years later, Polly found the wireless answer. In 1955, the self-taught engineer unveiled the Flashmatic, the first wireless television remote control ever built. It was shaped like a directional flashlight and aimed at 4 photocells mounted in the corners of the television screen. Point the beam at the lower left corner and the set muted. Point it at the lower right and it powered off. The upper corners changed the channel forward and back. Demand was so fierce that Zenith publicly apologized for failing to fill orders in September of that year. But the Flashmatic had one devastating flaw. Sunlight triggered the photocells. On a bright afternoon, the sun could change your channel, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. The sunlight problem killed the Flashmatic within a year. But another engineer was already inside the Zenith building, a man who had traveled a much longer road to get there, and he had found a solution that needed no light, no wire, and no battery at all. Robert Adler was born in Vienna on the 4th of December, 1913. His mother was a doctor. His father was a social theorist. Adler earned a doctorate in physics from the University of Vienna in 1937, and when Austria fell to the Nazis the following year, he fled. He was Jewish. He crossed into Belgium, then England, then the United States, and in 1941 he walked into the research division of Zenith in Chicago and began a career that would last nearly 60 years. Adler's insight was that light was unreliable and radio waves would interfere with the television signal, but sound, pitched above the range of human hearing, could carry a command across a room without disturbing anything. He designed a transmitter containing 4 aluminum rods of different lengths, each cut to vibrate at a specific ultrasonic frequency when struck by a tiny spring-loaded hammer. One frequency meant channel up, another meant channel down. A third controlled the volume. A fourth turned the set on and off. The handset held no batteries, no electronics, and no wires. The energy came entirely from the viewer's thumb pressing the button, which released the hammer, which struck the rod, which sang. The receiver inside the television, a sensitive microphone tuned to those 4 frequencies, and backed by 6 additional vacuum tubes, decoded the tone and executed the command. Zenith introduced the Space Command in 1956. It replaced Pauly's Flashmatic within the year. The engineering was cleaner, the sunlight problem was gone. The cost was steep. 6 extra vacuum tubes added roughly 30% to the retail price of the television, pushing a set that might have sold for $300 closer to $400. In the mid-1950s, that premium was more than a month's groceries for a typical American family. The Space Command was a luxury. Most households watched without one and changed the channel by hand. Pauly stayed at Zenith. He kept working. He remained at the company for another 27 years, retiring in 1982 with 18 patents to his name. Adler accumulated more than 180. The two men did not share a public credit for wireless remote control technology until 1997, when the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences awarded them a joint Emmy for their pioneering work. By then, Pauly was 81 and Adler was 83. And the device they had built between them sat in nearly every living room in the industrialized world. The question in 1956 had never been whether the remote worked. The question was, what would push it out of the luxury bracket and into every home? And the answer came not from a better remote, but from a cable running under the street. The remote control spent its first quarter century as a premium feature that most buyers skipped. Through the 1960s and into the 70s, the ultrasonic design remained the industry standard, and other manufacturers built their own versions of Adler's principle. But buying a remote still meant buying a more expensive television, and for a family that could afford only one set, the remote was the first thing dropped from the budget. What changed the equation was not an invention, it was multiplication. In the 1970s, cable television began threading into American homes, and with it came a problem the three-network era had never posed. When a viewer had 3 channels, getting up to turn the dial was a minor inconvenience. When a viewer had 30, it was absurd. Cable systems arrived with their own set-top boxes, and those boxes needed their own controls. The case for a remote shifted from luxury to necessity inside a single decade. The technology shifted with the demand. Around 1980, a Canadian engineer named Paul Hrivnak built an infrared remote for a cable television converter through his company, ViewStar. The device used a beam of low-frequency light, invisible to the human eye, pulsed with digital codes that the converter box could read. Infrared was cheaper to manufacture than ultrasonic. It could carry far more commands. It did not require the vacuum tubes that the Space Command's receiver had demanded. Infrared remotes could be mass-produced for a fraction of the cost, and by the mid-1980s, every new television in America shipped with one in the box. The ultrasonic era ended after 25 years, and more than 9 million sets sold. The aluminum rods fell silent. The remote was no longer about saving a man the walk across his living room. It was about control. The viewer now held in one hand the power to decide what survived on the screen and what disappeared. And that shift was about to reshape how television itself was made, sold, and paid for. But the infrared remote solved one old problem and created a new one, and the evidence was scattered across every coffee table in the country. The numbers tell the story faster than argument ever could. In 1979, only 17% of American households owned a remote control. By the end of the 1980s, more than 2/3 did. That surge was not driven by affection for the remote itself. It was driven by the multiplication of the machines that required one. The VCR arrived with its own remote. The cable box had another. The stereo receiver, the CD player, the laser disc player, each shipped with a separate infrared handset, its own codes, its own button layout, its own logic for what each key did. By the late 80s, the average living room held 3 to 5 remote controls, and the coffee table had become a low graveyard of black plastic rectangles that no one could tell apart in the dark. The remote did not merely change what people watched, it changed how they watched. The act of sitting through a program from opening titles to closing credits, the way a family had watched in the 1950s, gave way to something faster and more restless. People flipped. They sampled the first seconds of a channel and moved on. They grazed. A new vocabulary arrived to name what the remote had made possible. Channel surfing entered common speech in the early 1980s. Couch potato followed close behind. Networks, facing an audience that could vanish at the speed of a thumb, redesigned their programming to survive the first 3 seconds after a channel change. Building cold opens and pre-title hooks and teases before the break, all of them shaped to defeat the remote in the viewer's hand. The remote took the schedule out of the broadcaster's hands. It took the certainty out of the commercial break. It took the patience out of the viewer, and it gave all 3 to the person on the sofa, who had never asked for that much power and had no idea what to do with it except keep pressing the button. McDonald's original demand, a device that could kill a commercial from across the room, had been fulfilled beyond anything he might have imagined. He died in 1958, just 2 years after the Space Command launched, and never saw the remote become standard equipment. But the mute button he had insisted on was now in every hand. And the advertising industry's response was to make commercials louder, faster, and harder to look away from. The arms race between the mute button and the 30-second spot has never ended. The mess on the coffee table, meanwhile, was itself an engineering problem, and the first person to try solving it was, improbably, the man who had co-founded Apple. In 1985, Steve Wozniak had a problem in his home in the Santa Cruz Mountains. His entertainment system had accumulated so many components, each with its own remote, that operating an evening of television and music required a small engineering effort every time he sat down. Wozniak's answer was to start a company. He called it CL9, named after a restaurant called Cloud 9 near his home, and adjusted for trademark availability. And he set out to build what no one had successfully made, a single remote that could learn the infrared signals of every other remote in the house and replace them all. The device he shipped in 1987 was called the Core. It ran on a 6502 microprocessor, the same chip family that had powered his Apple II. It had an LCD display, 16 programmable keys, and the capacity to store 256 individual codes across 16 pages of functions. It could learn the signal pattern of any infrared remote pointed at its sensor, store the pattern, and reproduce it on command. It supported macros, so a single button press could fire a chain of actions. Power on the television, switch to the cable input, turn on the receiver, set the volume to 15. It cost $300. The Core was the first fully programmable universal remote, and it was too far ahead of the market to survive in it. Users found the generic keypad abstract and unfamiliar, too far removed from the dedicated buttons they already knew. Cheaper universal remotes from Philips and Magnavox, introduced in 1985 at lower prices with simpler interfaces, undercut it from the start. CL9 struggled and closed in 1988, just 3 years after its founding. Wozniak sold the patents. He went back to teaching elementary school. The problem he had chased would take another company and another decade to solve. That company was born in 2001 in Mississauga, Ontario, under the name Easy Zapper. It rebranded as Intrigue Technologies. And in 2004, Logitech acquired it for $29 million and renamed the product the Harmony. Where Wozniak had asked users to teach the remote one signal at a time, the Harmony connected to an online database of device codes. Plug it into a computer, tell the software what you owned, and the database sent the correct codes automatically. The approach worked. For nearly 20 years, the Harmony was the universal remote that home theater enthusiasts recommended above all others, the one installers placed in custom cabinets, the one that came closest to eliminating the pile of remotes on the table. But the heart of the remote control story is not the universal. It is the original. The Space Command deserves its own moment here. Hold one if you ever get the chance. The case is chrome and plastic, cool in the palm. Smaller than a modern smartphone, but heavier, more certain of its purpose. There is no battery compartment because nothing inside requires power. Turn it over and you find 4 buttons and the Zenith name. Press a button and you feel the spring resistance of the hammer, and then you hear it. A short, clean, metallic click. The sound of a small hammer striking an aluminum rod a few centimeters long. That sound, or rather the ultrasonic harmonic riding above it, is what once crossed 10 or 15 feet of open air in a 1950s living room, struck the microphone hidden inside a television cabinet, and told the set what to do. Most adults could not hear the tone itself. Dogs could. Children often could. Families reported their pets reacting every time someone pressed the button, ears pricking, heads turning toward a sound the grown-ups could not detect. More than 9 million ultrasonic remote control televisions were sold before infrared replaced the design in the early 1980s. Today, a working original Space Command from the 1950s brings $80 to $175 on the collector market. with the earliest models commanding the highest prices. The chrome is usually oxidized. The mechanism still clicks. By the mid-2000s, the devices the remote was built to control were themselves beginning to disappear. Cable subscriptions were falling. The DVD player was gathering dust behind the screen. The television itself was growing smarter, absorbing the functions of the machines that once surrounded it. And with every function it absorbed, it eliminated the need for one more remote on the table. The Harmony had solved the problem of too many remotes just in time for the problem to begin solving itself. The remote had spent half a century becoming essential. Now, the screen was about to try to swallow it whole. The screen did not swallow the remote in one motion. It took years, and the instrument that absorbed it was not a better remote, but a device that had never been designed to control a television at all. The smartphone arrived. By the late 2000s, applications that turned a phone into a television remote were appearing in every app store, and the phone already had everything it needed, from a wireless connection and a touchscreen to a permanent place in the viewer's hand. The phone was, in a way, the universal remote that Wozniak had tried to build 20 years earlier, except that it also made calls, took photographs, played music, and checked the weather. The remote was just another function absorbed into a machine that absorbed everything. Television manufacturers saw the direction and responded. Smart TVs shipped with stripped-down remotes, carrying fewer buttons and simpler layouts than anything the market had seen since the lazy bones. Apple launched Apple TV with a Siri remote so minimal it was barely there, carrying a touchpad, a microphone, and a few small buttons on a slab of aluminum thinner than a pencil. Amazon built its voice assistant Alexa into Fire TV devices. Google followed. The viewer could now say play or pause, or go back 30 seconds. And the screen obeyed without a hand being lifted from the armrest. The spoken command was replacing the button press. HDMI CEC, a protocol that allowed devices connected through a single cable to respond to a single remote, shrank the pile on the coffee table to one handset or nothing at all. In April of 2021, Logitech announced that it would discontinue the Harmony line. The universal remote, the product category that Wozniak had invented and the Harmony had dominated for nearly 2 decades, was finished as a mass-market object. The reason was not that the Harmony had failed. It was that the problem it solved had dissolved beneath it. Cable boxes were leaving homes. DVD players were already gone. The streaming service lived inside the television or the phone and needed no separate controller. The coffee table, once buried under 5 remotes, was clear. The remote did not die. It did something stranger. It dissolved. The camera dissolved into the phone. The radio dissolved into the app. The alarm clock dissolved into the notification. And the remote control dissolved into the screen, so completely that most people under 30 have never thought of changing a channel as a physical act performed by a physical object held in the hand. The generational math is blunt. The first television remote weighed 8 ounces and contained no electronics. The function it performed, choosing what plays on a screen, now lives inside a device that weighs under 6 ounces and holds more processing power than every television Zenith manufactured in the 1950s combined. The $30 cable of the Lazy Bones, the 30% premium of the Space Command, the $300 ambition of Wozniak's Core, all collapsed into a software button that costs nothing and lives on a screen the viewer already owns. A child born today will grow up choosing what to watch by speaking to the room, and the idea that their grandparents once stood up, crossed a floor, and physically turned a knob to switch the channel will sound as foreign to them as hand cranking a car engine. You can read the remote's disappearance 2 ways, and Honest History holds both at once. One reading says the viewer won. The power that Eugene MacDonald demanded in 1950, the ability to command the screen without standing up, is now so total and so instant that it has become invisible. Every tap on a streaming app, every voice command to a speaker, every swipe across a phone screen is the remote control under another name. The viewer has more authority over what plays than any generation before. The second reading is less comfortable. The algorithm now decides what appears on the screen before the viewer's hand reaches for anything. The home page is curated. The next episode autoplays. The recommendation engine is designed to keep the viewer seated and watching, which is precisely what the remote was built to achieve in the first place. Except that the viewer is no longer the one making the choice. The remote gave the viewer veto power over the broadcast schedule. The algorithm quietly reclaimed it. But the machines themselves are not gone. Working space commands from the 1950s still sell on the collector market for $80 to $175, and the chrome cases that survive in the best condition command the highest prices. Enthusiasts restore vintage Zenith television sets with their original remotes, testing the ultrasonic mechanism against the tuned receiver, listening for the click that proves the aluminum rods still vibrate at the correct frequency after nearly 70 years. The communities that keep these machines alive are small but persistent, scattered across forums and collector shows, and the knowledge they carry, the specific ultrasonic frequencies, the correct vacuum tube replacements, the technique for cleaning oxidized chrome without scratching the finish underneath, would vanish without them. Philco mystery controls from the late 1930s, the wireless radio remotes that preceded television entirely, are rarer still because the small wooden handsets were so often separated from their console radios and thrown away decades ago. The function the remote introduced, the power to command a screen without crossing a room, now lives inside every device that carries a display. The volume rocker on a phone, the pause key on a laptop, the voice command to a speaker in the kitchen. Everyone is a descendant of 4 aluminum rods struck by 4 tiny hammers in a chrome case. Robert Adler died on the 15th of February, 2007 at 93 in a nursing home in Boise, Idaho. He had held more than 180 patents and had continued advising Zenith until 1999, 17 years past his official retirement. Eugene Pauly died on the 20th of May, 2012 at 96 in Downers Grove, Illinois. He had spent 47 years at the company where he started as a stock clerk, and he never stopped believing that the Flashmatic deserved more credit than it received. The two men shared an Emmy in 1997, 42 years after the inventions that connected them. By the time Pauly died, the device they had built between them had been used by more human beings than almost any other single object in the history of consumer electronics. In 1956, a tiny hammer struck an aluminum rod inside a chrome and plastic case in a Chicago showroom, and a television set changed its channel without being touched. The click was barely audible. The ultrasonic tone above it was silent to most of the adults in the room, though the dogs heard it, and the children might have. That click named the device. The device named a behavior. The behavior rearranged how a civilization watched, what it watched, and who decided what survived on the screen long enough to be seen. The remote control was built to save a man from crossing his living room, and it ended up deciding what television became. If you remember the click, the one that changed the channel before infrared made everything silent. Drop a comment below. Tell us the remote, the television, and the year, and tell us whether you were the one in the family who got to hold it. The people who lived with these machines know more about what the remote actually changed than any history written after the fact. Subscribe to Digital Relics if you want to keep following the machines that shaped how people live, traced all the way back to the first prototype and the hands that built it. We have the origin of another device that rearranged the shape of a room coming next, and you will not want to miss where it began.